What if I told you that the American Civil War was not decided by the most brilliant general, but by the one who simply refused to step back? For 3 years, Robert E. Lee had defeated every Union commander sent against him. Larger armies, better supplies, more men, and every time they bled, they retreated. But in 1864, everything changed. A quiet cigar-smoking general named Ulysses S. Grant did something no one expected. After one of the bloodiest battles of the war, he didn't turn north. He moved south. In this video, you'll witness the moment Lee realized he was facing a man unlike any he had ever fought. A general who would not go back, no matter the cost. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. In the spring of 1864, the earth of Virginia trembled beneath the boots of men who no longer believed this war would end in glory. For 3 years, the Army of Northern Virginia had followed one man with near religious faith, Robert E. Lee, calm, dignified, unshaken. To his soldiers, he was not merely a commander. He was a symbol of destiny. And for 3 years, destiny had favored him. He had outmaneuvered larger armies. He had humiliated cautious Union generals. He had faced commanders who, when blood soaked the fields and casualty lists, climbed too high, did what most men would do. They went back after the 7 days. They went back after Second Manassas. They went back after Fredericksburg. They went back even after Chancellorsville, Lee's boldest gamble. They eventually went back even after Chancellorsville, Lee's boldest gamble. Lee had come to understand something about his enemy. The North had men, industry, and numbers, but its generals hesitated. They feared loss. They feared Washington. They feared blame. Then, in 1864, a new man arrived. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. He did not look like destiny. He did not speak like destiny. He did not speak like destiny. He did not inspire poetry or romance. He wore mud-stained uniforms, smoked cheap cigars, and spoke in quiet sentences that carried no drama. But behind the silence was something Lee had never truly faced before: resolve without retreat. The first collision came in the tangled nightmare known as the wilderness. The forest burned. Muskets flashed blindly through thick undergrowth. Men fought at distances so close they could see terror in each other's eyes. The dead lay where they fell, sometimes consumed by flames that no one could reach. It was chaos, the kind of battle Lee understood. Confusion favored boldness, and boldness had always been his weapon. When the smoke cleared, the losses were staggering on both sides. Grant had taken terrible casualties. Washington expected what had always happened before: withdrawal. Lee expected it too, because that is what every other Union commander had done. But something strange happened. Instead of turning north, the Union Army began moving south, toward Richmond, toward Lee. Grant was not retreating. He was advancing. An officer rode to Lee with the news. Grant was not pulling back to regroup. He was not returning to Washington to explain losses. He was sidestepping, maneuvering, pressing forward. Lee understood instantly. This man, he is said to have remarked, will not go back. And in those words was the quiet recognition of a new reality. Grant did not fight for applause. He did not chase dramatic victories. He did not seek to outshine Lee in tactical brilliance. Instead, he understood something colder. The Confederacy could not replace its losses. The Union could cad. Grant was willing to fight a war of attrition, a grinding, relentless pressure that would never release its grip. At Spotsylvania, the fighting raged for days under torrential rain. At the Bloody Angle, men fought hand to hand across breastworks slick with mud and blood. Entire regiments vanished in hours. Again, casualties mounted. Again, Lee waited for the familiar pattern. Again, Grant shifted south. He would not go back. But again, Grant shifted south. He would not go back. Lee began to see the difference. Previous Union generals feared defeat more than they desired victory. He accepted loss as the terrible arithmetic of war. He would trade space for momentum. He would trade men for position. He would keep moving. At Cold Harbor, the Union assault was catastrophic. Thousands fell in less than an hour. It was one of the most lopsided and tragic charges of the war. Even Grant would later admit regret, but he did not retreat. Instead, he crossed the James River in a daring maneuver and drove toward Petersburg. Threatening Richmond's lifeline, Lee was now fighting not a campaign of grand movements, but a slow tightening noose. For Lee, this was more than a military problem. It was a psychological one. He had built his strategy on the belief that one more crushing blow might break Northern will, that a dramatic victory could shift politics in Washington, exhaust public support, and force negotiations. But Grant's strategy made that impossible. Grant was not fighting for headlines. He was fighting for endurance. He understood that the Union did not need brilliance. It needed persistence. Lee, brilliant and daring, suddenly faced an opponent who would not be dazzled, would not be discouraged, and would not be discouraged, and would not disengage. Every road Lee took, Grant followed. Every defensive line Lee constructed, Grant flanked. Every victory Lee claimed cost him something he could never replace. Men, time, hope. By the time the army settled into the trenches around Petersburg, the war had transformed. It was no longer a contest of maneuver, but of survival. Months passed, supplies thinned, desertions increased, horses starved. Richmond, once defiant, felt the tightening grip of inevitability. Lee still inspired loyalty. His soldiers still adored him. But even he could see what lay ahead. Grant would not go back, and because he would not go back, the Confederacy could not go back. The Confederacy could not go forward. In April 1865, the lines finally broke. Petersburg fell. Richmond was abandoned. Lee's army retreated west, exhausted, hungry, pursued without pause. Grant did not rush recklessly. He maneuvered, he cut off escape routes. He anticipated movements. He pressed, always pressed, until there was nowhere left to go. At Appomattox Court House, beneath quiet spring trees, Lee rode to meet the man he had come to understand better than any opponent. Robert E. Lee arrived in immaculate gray. Ulysses S. Grant arrived in mud-splattered blue. The contrast was almost symbolic. Lee had fought with audacity, brilliance, and faith in decisive victory. Grant had fought with endurance, calculation, and the unyielding belief that persistence would win the day. And in the end, it did. History often celebrates dramatic genius, the bold charge, the daring flank, the impossible gamble. But sometimes, history is decided by something quieter, by the man who refuses to step back on something quieter, by the man who refuses to step back himself. He felt it at Spotsylvania. He understood it at Petersburg. This was not an enemy who would break after bloodshed, not a general who would protect his reputation by withdrawing, not a commander who measured success by elegance. Grant measured success by outcome, and the outcome was inevitable. When Lee surrendered, he did so not to theatrics, not to humiliation, but to persistence. The war ended not because Lee lacked courage or skill. It ended because he faced, at last, a general unlike any he had ever fought, a man who would not go back, and in war, sometimes that is enough. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join Theates. Subscribe to join Theates, space of presence, and share your deepest now in the comments below. In May 1864, the Army of the Potomac marched into a wilderness that seemed almost designed to swallow men whole. The dense thickets of scrub oak and second-growth timber tangled artillery lines, broke formations, and turned orderly battle plans into chaos. Visibility shrank to yards. Smoke from black powder clung to the trees, refusing to lift. In that suffocating maze of brush and fire, two armies collided with a violence that stunned even veterans of 3 years of civil war. At the center of it all stood Robert E. Lee, the commander who had come to embody Confederate defiance. For years, he had faced larger Union forces and beaten them with speed, boldness, and intuition. He had learned the rhythms of his enemy. When Union casualties mounted and confusion spread, their generals hesitated. They withdrew across rivers. They regrouped. They wrote cautious reports to Washington. They preserved their reputations and lived to fight another day. Lee had built his strategy around that pattern. He did not need to destroy the Union Army outright. He only needed to bloody it badly enough that its commander would recoil. Opposite him now was a different kind of soldier, Ulysses S. Grant. He did not carry himself with aristocratic grace. He did not issue grand proclamations. His uniform was often wrinkled and spattered with mud. He rode quietly, listening more than speaking. Yet beneath that unassuming exterior was a clarity of purpose that few yet understood. The Battle of the Wilderness began on May 5th. Almost immediately, the forest erased the advantages of artillery and cavalry. Men fired at muzzle flashes. Units lost contact with their flanks. Officers shouted commands that vanished into gunfire. Brush caught flame, and wounded soldiers, unable to crawl away, were overtaken by smoke and heat. The battlefield became a furnace. Lee, recognizing opportunity in the confusion, struck hard. He launched aggressive attacks, hoping to unbalance the Union advance before it could fully deploy. The chaos favored audacity, and audacity had always been his strength. At moments, Confederate counterattacks drove deep into Union lines. Panic rippled through segments of blue-coated infantry. The fighting swayed back and forth with brutal intimacy. Grant's army suffered terribly. Casualty lists lengthened by the hour. Corps commanders reported staggering losses. The noise, the fire, the screams of the wounded created an atmosphere that tested the limits of endurance. Many officers assumed what had happened so many times before do happen again. They believed that once the cost became clear, the army would pivot northward toward the safety of supply lines and familiar ground. For years, that expectation had shaped Confederate confidence. When previous Union commanders had encountered Lee in terrain that nullified their numerical advantage, they faltered. They recoiled after setbacks. They interpreted heavy casualties as proof that the campaign had failed. Lee had grown accustomed to this rhythm. He would strike, absorb, counterstrike, and then watch the blue columns recede. As the second day of fighting ended, neither side could claim a decisive victory. The forest was littered with the dead, and dying units were shattered. Officers could barely assemble coherent reports. Grant had lost thousands. Lee had lost thousands. The tactical situation remained unresolved, but strategically, everything hinged on the next movement. In the Union camps that night, tension was thick. Soldiers whispered around low fires. Some believed the army would retreat at dawn. Others feared another frontal assault into the inferno. Corps commanders awaited orders. They had seen what Lee could do when an opponent hesitated. They knew Washington watched closely. Political pressure had undone men before. Grant rode quietly through the darkness, absorbing reports, weighing options. He understood the cost. He felt it in the exasha, who stead faces of his men in the silence where regiments once stood strong. Yet he also understood something deeper. Retreat would only reset the pattern that had prolonged the war. Withdrawal would hand Lee not just ground, but psychological confirmation that the Confederacy could still repel superior numbers through sheer audacity. Morning came with damp air and lingering smoke. Orders began to circulate, not for retreat, but for movement. Columns shifted, supply trains adjusted. Instead of turning north toward the Rapidan River, the Army of the Potomac angled south. Word spread slowly at first. Soldiers, who had braced for the long march back toward Washington, realized the army was moving forward, sideways, southward toward Richmond. There was confusion, then dawning comprehension. The campaign was not over. The fight would continue. When news reached Lee that Grant had not retreated, it carried more weight than any battlefield report. This was not the familiar pattern. The Union commander had absorbed the blow and refused to disengage. He was maneuvering around Lee's right, forcing another confrontation. Lee grasped the significance immediately. He was no longer facing an opponent who measured success by the absence of risk. He faced a commander who accepted loss as part of a larger design. Grant was not seeking a single perfect victory. He was applying continuous pressure, determined to remain between Lee and Richmond, determined to keep contact no matter the cost. The psychological shift was profound. For Confederate soldiers, the knowledge that the Union Army still stood in front of them, still advancing, challenged assumptions formed over years of campaigning. They had grown used to watching blue columns withdraw after bloody engagements. Now, instead of relief, they saw renewed movement. Grant's decision in those hours after the Wilderness did more than reposition an army. It altered the character of the war in Virginia. It signaled that there would be no pause for reorganization in distant camps, no months of recovery before the next offensive. The Army of Northern Virginia would have to march, dig, and fight again immediately. Lee began to sense that he was confronting a different calculus. Every battle would cost him irreplaceable veterans. Every battle would cost him irreplaceable veterans. Every engagement would thin the ranks of men who had survived since Manassas and Antietam. The Confederacy lacked the reserves to trade losses indefinitely. Grant, by contrast, drew from a broader base of manpower and industry. As Union troops moved southward, many understood the meaning instinctively. A soldier reportedly exclaimed that Grant would fight it out if it takes all summer. Whether those exact words were spoken or later remembered through the haze of legend, they captured the mood, the fear. Army was not retreating from the Wilderness. It was stepping into a campaign defined by relentless contact. Lee prepared to intercept, to strike again, to exploit terrain as he had so many times before. Yet the certainty that had once underpinned his strategy now carried a new shadow. He could no longer rely on his opponent to withdraw after suffering. He could no longer assume that inflicting pain would end the immediate threat. The rhythm of advance and retreat had been broken. Grant's southward movement after the Wilderness was not a dramatic charge or a sweeping victory parade. It was a quiet, deliberate turn of columns along dusty Virginia roads. But within that movement lay a profound transformation. The Army of the Potomac was no longer an army seeking to avoid defeat. It had become an army determined to remain in contact, to press, to absorb, and to continue forward regardless of the cost. In that moment, amid smoke-stained forests and fields still warm from fire, Lee recognized that the familiar script had changed. He was facing a commander who would not recoil from bloodshed, who would not step back to preserve appearances, who would not grant him the strategic breathing room that had so often followed fierce engagements. The realization settled in not as panic, but as a cold acknowledgement that the contest ahead would be unlike any he had fought before. If you state illness in these words, subscribe to join Stas' Space of Presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. After the smoke drifted away from the tangled inferno of the Wilderness, the campaign did not pause. It accelerated. Ulysses S. Grant had made his intention unmistakable. There would be no turning back. The Army of the Potomac shifted south, and with that movement began a relentless sequence of clashes that would redefine the character of the war in Virginia. Robert E. Lee understood immediately what this meant. Grant was not seeking a single decisive Napoleonic triumph. He was applying continuous pressure, forcing Lee to react again and again. The space between battles shrank. The intervals of rest disappeared. What followed became known as the Overland Campaign, a grinding march of blood and maneuver from the wilderness toward Richmond. The next collision came at Spotsylvania Court House. The two armies raced along parallel roads, each trying to secure advantageous ground. Cavalry skirmished in clouds of dust. Infantry marched through rain and mud, blistered and exhausted from the wilderness. Lee's men, hardened by years of campaigning, dug in along a series of defensive lines shaped like a great inverted U earthworks rose quickly. Trees were felled, trenches carved, artillery positioned behind breastworks of dirt and timber. Grant arrived and attacked. The fighting at Spotsylvania was savage beyond description. On May 12th, Union forces struck a protruding section of the Confederate line known as the Mule Shoe. Before dawn, in thick fog, blue-coated soldiers surged forward and smashed into the Confederate defenses. For hours, perhaps the most intense hand-to-hand combat of the war unfolded at a position later called the Bloody Angle. Men fired at point-blank range across log barricades. Muskets grew so hot they burned hands. Bayonets flashed in the rain. The ground turned to mud, mixed with blood. Trees nearly 2 feet thick were cut down by rifle fire, alone splintered and shredded by thousands of bullets. The wounded lay beneath the feet of the living. Soldiers slipped and fell on bodies as they fought for inches of earth. Casualties mounted with horrifying speed. Grant knew the price. Reports flowed into his headquarters detailing shattered brigades and missing regiments. Entire commands had been reduced to fragments. Yet even as the losses accumulated, he did not order withdrawal. He reinforced the pressure. He extended his lines. He probed for weakness. Lee countered fiercely. He shifted units along interior lines, plugging gaps, rallying brigades with his personal presence. At one critical moment, as Union troops threatened to break through entirely, Lee attempted to ride forward and lead a counterattack himself. His soldiers famously refused to let him expose himself to direct fire, crying out for him to go to the rear. The devotion they felt for him remained unshaken but dead. Devotion alone could not restore the men already lost. Days of brutal stalemate followed. Rain fell steadily, turning trenches into pits of standing water. Courses bloated in the heat. Sharpshooters fired relentlessly at any movement above the earthworks. Neither army could claim a clear tactical victory, yet strategically Grant maintained control of the campaign's momentum. When the fighting reached a standstill, he did not disengage. He moved again, south purport. Now yet anticipated this pattern, now yet anticipated this pattern, now yet anticipated did not make it easier to counter. Every shift forced his army to march, dig, and prepare for renewed assault. Every mile brought them closer to Richmond. Every engagement thinned his ranks, further Grant's persistence. Unsettled Confederate expectations. Previous Union generals had treated heavy losses as a signal to pause operations. Grant treated them as part of a broader calculation. He believed that constant engagement would eventually erode Lee's capacity to resist. The Confederacy lacked the manpower reserves of the North. Every veteran lost at Spotsylvania could not be replaced with equal experience or skill. The next major clash came at North Anna, where Lee again attempted to use terrain and defensive geometry to divide and potentially trap segments of the Union Army. He arranged his lines in an inverted V shape, hoping to lure Grant into attacking one wing and odd, de-exposing the other. Illness temporarily weakened Lee during this phase, yet his strategic instincts remained sharp. Grant cautious yet persistent, probed the Confederate positions. Skirmishing erupted. Artillery boomed across the river crossings. The opportunity for a devastating Confederate counterstroke flickered briefly, but never fully materialized. Grant sensed the risk and adjusted. He refused to be drawn into a trap that might reverse the campaign's momentum. Once more, he sidestepped. The armies marched toward Cold Harbor. By now, the pattern was unmistakable. Engagement. Bloodshed. Maneuver engagement. Again. Soldiers on both sides began to understand that there would be no extended respite. The Overland Campaign had become a relentless contest of endurance. At Cold Harbor, Lee entrenched along formidable defensive lines east of Richmond. The earthworks were deep, reinforced, and supported by overlapping fields of fire. Grant, believing he could break through before the Confederates fully consolidated, ordered a frontal assault on June 3rd. The result was catastrophic. Union troops advanced across open ground under withering fire. In less than an hour, thousands fell. Some units were pinned so close to Confederate lines that the wounded lay between the trenches for days, unable to be retrieved. Soldiers pinned notes to their uniforms, identifying themselves, anticipating death. The losses at Cold Harbor shook even Grant. He later admitted regret for ordering the assault. Yet what defined him was not the mistake. It was his response to it. He did not retreat north, instead he devised a bold maneuver, crossing the James River to strike at Petersburg, the rail hub supplying Richmond. The movement required secrecy, coordination, and speed. Under cover of night and careful planning, the Army of the Potomac disengaged and executed one of the most impressive logistical shifts of the war. Lee reacted quickly, but again he found himself responding to Grant's initiative. The campaign had evolved into a chess match played under the shadow of enormous casualties. The armies would soon entrench around Petersburg in a prolonged siege that foreshadowed the trench warfare of the next century. Throughout these weeks, from the Wilderness to Spotsylvania, from North Anna to Cold Harbor, Grant maintained unbroken contact with Lee. He never allowed significant distance to open between them. He did not concede the field after setbacks. He did not abandon the objective of moving steadily toward Richmond. For Confederate soldiers, the psychological weight of this persistence grew heavier with each clash. They could no longer rely on a single bloody repulse to end the campaign. Even when they held their ground, the Union Army reappeared on another flank. Then, when they inflicted staggering losses, the blue lines formed again. His defensive skill, his ability to read terrain, and his rapport with his men continued to inspire fierce resistance. Yet the operational tempo imposed by Grant eroded the margin for recovery. There was no season of regrouping, no long lull to rebuild shattered brigades. The Overland Campaign was not a series of isolated battles. It was a sustained hammering, an unbroken chain of confrontations that demanded constant vigilance. Grant accepted the cost as the necessary burden of ending the war. He understood that disengagement would only prolong the struggle. So the armies marched, dug, fought, and marched again. The landscape of Virginia became scarred with trenches and graves. Veterans who had survived earlier campaigns now faced a new reality. The enemy would not disappear after inflicting or receiving punishment. Grant's refusal to disengage after the Wilderness had transformed into a sustained strategy of relentless pressure. From Spotsylvania's bloody angle to the slaughter at Cold Harbor, he maintained the initiative, forcing Lee into continuous reaction, shaping the campaign not through a single brilliant stroke, but through an unwavering determination to press forward regardless of loss. By 1864, the war had already devoured hundreds of thousands of lives, yet its outcome remained uncertain. Battles had been won and lost, cities taken and retaken, But the Confederacy still stood. For years, the struggle in Virginia had revolved around maneuver and counterstroke, around the tactical brilliance of Robert E. Lee and the hesitation of the generals sent against him. What changed in the spring of that year was not simply a commander, it was the very logic of how the war would be fought. Ulysses S. Grant did not enter the campaign believing he needed a single, spectacular victory to end the conflict. He did not seek to outshine Lee in daring battlefield theatrics. Instead, he recognized a harsher truth. The Confederacy was finite, its manpower was limited, its industrial base was strained, its railroads were fragile, its factories could not match the relentless output of Northern industry. If the war became a contest of endurance rather than brilliance, the balance would tilt inexorably toward the Union. Grant understood numbers with cold clarity. The North possessed a far larger population. It controlled the majority of the nation's manufacturing capacity. Its rail network was denser, its shipyards busier, its foundries hotter. Each month, new regiments could be raised, trained, and sent to the front. Replacement rifles, ammunition, uniforms, and artillery pieces rolled off production lines in staggering quantities. The South, by contrast, had already drawn deeply from its reserves. Farms struggled to produce enough food. Rail lines deteriorated under constant strain and limited maintenance. Blockades tightened around Confederate ports, restricting imports of weapons and supplies. Each experienced soldier lost was not merely a casualty. It was a wound a Confederacy could not fully heal. Grant's strategy of attrition was built upon this imbalance. Attrition did not mean reckless slaughter for its own sake. It meant maintaining relentless pressure, forcing continuous engagement, and ensuring that every exchange of casualties, however costly, weakened the Confederacy proportionally more than the Union. In previous years, when Union armies had suffered heavy losses, they often withdrew to rebuild morale and numbers. That withdrawal gave Lee space to reorganize, recruit replacements, and restore his army's cohesion. The war reset. The strategic clock turned backward. Grant refused to allow that reset. By keeping constant contact with Lee's army, he denied the Confederates the breathing room they desperately needed. Every battle was followed not by months of recovery, but by immediate maneuver. Every defensive stand was succeeded by another confrontation. Lee's army could fight with extraordinary skill and courage, but it could not multiply its fallen. This was the heart of attrition. Time and persisty. Noose's weapons, Grant did not ignore the human cost. He read casualty reports with full knowledge of what they represented. You men from farms and cities, from factories and schools who would never return home. He wrote letters of condolence. He felt the political pressure that came with mounting losses. Newspapers criticized him, branding him a butcher. Critics in Washington questioned whether such bloodshed could be justified. Yet Grant believed that prolonging the war through hesitation would cost even more lives in the end. A decisive, sustained application of pressure, however brutal, might shorten the conflict. To disengage would only stretch the agony across more years, more campaigns, more families. For Lee, the reality was stark. His army had long relied on superior leadership, interior lines, and defensive positioning to offset numerical inferiority. He could win tactical victories. He could repel assaults. He could maneuver skillfully across Virginia's rivers and forests. But he could not create men out of thin air. Every veteran lost at the Wilderness or Spotsylvania represented experience forged through years of campaigning. These were soldiers who knew how to hold a line under fire, who could march for days without complaint, who understood Lee's expectations without lengthy orders. Replacements, when they arrived at all, were often younger, less trained, less. As hardened Grant's strategy targeted that irreplaceable core. It was not about seizing territory alone. It was about forcing Lee to commit his army repeatedly to expend its strength in defense after defense. Even when Lee held the field, the arithmetic of loss worked quietly against him. Meanwhile, the Union machine continued turning. Reinforcements arrived from northern states. Railroads transported fresh supplies with remarkable efficiency. Factories in cities like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia churned out artillery and ammunition. The Navy maintained pressure along southern coasts and rivers, constricting economic lifelines. Attrition extended beyond the battlefield. It was economic, logistical, psychological. As Confederate resources dwindled, shortages became routine. Soldiers lacked adequate shoes, uniforms, and rations. Civilians felt the strain as inflation soared and goods disappeared from markets. The war effort demanded sacrifice from every corner of Southern society, yet the capacity to sustain that sacrifice diminished with each passing month. Grant's design intertwined military action with this broader reality. By engaging Lee continuously in Virginia, he fixed the Confederacy's most formidable army in place. It could not be detached easily to reinforce other fronts. It could not rest long enough to rebuild fully. The pressure in Virginia complemented Union. Advances elsewhere, through Georgia, along the Mississippi, across the Western Theater. Lee saw the pattern emerging. He was no longer confronting a commander seeking a dramatic battlefield coup. He was facing a general who believed that steady, grinding engagement would eventually exhaust the Confederacy's capacity to resist. Lee could still inspire his men. He could still construct formidable defenses. He could still deliver punishing blows. But the strategic tide was shifting beneath his feet. Attrition was a merciless strategy because it acknowledged that war is not always decided by genius in a single afternoon. Sometimes it is decided by which side can endure the longest strain. Grant accepted that endurance as the Union's advantage and built his campaign around it. In the trenches around Petersburg, this logic became visible in stark form. Lines stretched for miles. Artillery duels echoed day after day. Raids, probes, and assaults chipped away at Confederate positions. Months passed. The Confederate army remained defiant but grew thinner, more fragile. Desertions increased. Supplies ran short. Horses starved. The once fluid war in Virginia hardened into siege and stalemate, yet even stalemate favored the side with deeper reserves. Grant's War of Attrition was not glamorous. It did not produce sweeping cavalry charges. Celebrated in paintings, it produced mud trenches, exhaustion, and casualty lists that weighed heavily on the national conscience. But it steadily constricted Lee's options. Each failed attempt to break the Union lines cost strength that could not be restored. Each defensive success was temporary, bought with resources that dwindled faster than they could be replenished. The Confederacy had gambled that Northern will would fracture under prolonged bloodshed. Grant inverted that gamble. He wagered that Southern capacity would collapse first under sustained, unrelenting pressure. He understood that the Union's industrial might and population were not abstract statistics. They were strategic assets that, when paired with unwavering persistence, could decide the war. As months passed and the lines tightened, the arithmetic became undeniable. Attrition was not a single battle, but a process. It was the slow erosion of an army that could fight brilliantly, but could not replace its losses. It was the steady depletion of supplies that could not be manufactured quickly enough. It was the wearing down of a nation already stretched to its limits. Grant's strategy did not depend on dazzling Lee in open field maneuvers. It depended on remaining in contact, forcing confrontation after confrontation, ensuring that the Confederacy's finite strength was tested again and again without respite. For years, war in Virginia had followed a familiar, emotional rhythm for Robert E. Lee. He would study the terrain, read the hesitation in his opponent, and strike with audacity at the decisive moment. Even when outnumbered, he trusted in speed, surprise, and the fighting spirit of his men, and again, his adversaries confirmed his understanding of them. They were careful, they were politically constrained, they feared catastrophic loss more than they desired total victory. That pattern shaped Lee's confidence. It was not arrogance, but experience. He had faced commanders who paused after setbacks, who retreated across rivers to reorganize, who allowed him to recover from bold gambles. Each time the Union Army pulled back, it reinforced his belief that nerve and daring could compensate for numerical inferiority. Then came Ulysses S. Grant. Grant did not present himself as a theatrical rival. He did not issue dramatic pronouncements or cultivate a larger-than-life presence. There was no aura of aristocratic refinement about him, no sweeping gestures designed to inspire headlines. His manner was plain. His voice was quiet. He appeared almost indifferent to spectacle. At first glance, Lee might have assumed that such a man would be predictable. Another cautious Union commander, another officer who would falter when confronted with the ferocity of the Army of Northern Virginia. But from the wilderness onward, something subtle yet profound shifted in Lee's perception. Grant absorbed punishment without retreat. At Spotsylvania, even after hours of brutal fighting, at the Bloody Angle, when men fell in heaps and entire brigades dissolved under fire, Grant did not disengage. He shifted his lines. He probed again. He prepared for the next movement south. There was no dramatic withdrawal, no pause long enough for Lee to savor a defensive success. Lee began to recognize that he was facing not a man seeking brilliance, but a man seeking outcome. This realization was psychological before it was strategic. War between seasoned commanders is as much a contest of wills as of arms. Lee had long relied on his ability to read his opponent's mind, anticipating fear, hesitation, and political caution. Now he confronted a general who seemed almost immune to those pressures. Grant did not respond to bloodshed with retreat. He responded with adjustment. Each time Lee repelled an assault, he prepared for the Union Army to fall back and regroup at a distance. Instead, he saw blue columns shifting to another flank, entrenching closer, pressing forward by degrees. It was not reckless fury. It was steady determination. For Lee, this demanded a recalibration of instinct. He could not intimidate Grant through audacity alone. He could not rely on a single sharp blow to force a pause in operations. Grant's tolerance, for loss, grim and unsentimental, made him resistant to the psychological shock that had undone others. This was not indifference to human cost. It was a different calculation of it. Grant believed that ending the war required sustained engagement. Lee, observing this pattern, realized that he was facing an opponent who viewed casualties as part of a larger arithmetic, not as a trigger for retreat. That difference altered the emotional landscape of the campaign. Lee's soldiers continued to fight with extraordinary courage. Their loyalty to him was unshaken. They trusted his judgment and admired his calm under fire. But even the most devoted army senses when the character of its enemy has changed. The Union forces they now confronted did not dissolve after bloody clashes. They reformed and advanced again. Lee's brilliance lay in maneuver and concentration of force. He excelled at seizing fleeting opportunities, dividing enemy armies, striking exposed flanks, exploiting hesitation against cautious opponents. This method produced dramatic victories. Grant denied him hesitation. Instead of offering weeks to reorganize after each engagement, Grant compressed time. Battles bled into marches into fresh confrontations. Lee was compelled to react continuously. The tempo left little margin for recovery or daring counteroffensives that required rest and preparation. Psycho Logically, this meant Lee was no longer dictating the campaign's rhythm. He was responding to it. That shift, subtle yet profound, marked the turning point in how he perceived his adversary. Grant was not chasing glory. He was not attempting to outmaneuver Lee in a single sweeping stroke. He was applying pressure like a vice, tightening gradually, inexorably at Cold Harbor, when Union assaults were repulsed with devastating losses. Lee might once have expected a withdrawal northward. Instead, he watched as Grant disengaged laterally, crossing the James River in a bold movement that threatened Petersburg. It was not the action of a defeated man seeking refuge. It was the maneuver of a commander refusing to abandon initiative, single personality. Grant did not appear shaken by public criticism. Newspapers called him a butcher. Casualty figures mounted alarmingly. Political leaders worried about the cost. Yet the Union Army continued its advance. Grant's steadiness insulated him from the kind of pressure that might have compelled another general to seek safety and caution. This realization forced Lee to confront a harsher strategic truth. If his opponent would not withdraw after losses, then inflicting losses alone would not secure victory. Tactical success would not automatically translate into strategic relief. The confide, Racy's traditional method, winning battles to influence Northern morale and politics, was losing its leverage. Grant's psychological resilience neutralized that strategy. Lee had long believed that the North's will to fight could be shaken by dramatic defeats. He had gambled on that belief repeatedly. But Grant's presence signaled that Northern leadership had shifted toward persistence rather than sensitivity to battlefield reverses. The psychological turning point was not a single moment of revelation. It unfolded across weeks of observation. Each time Grant refused to retreat, each time he sidestepped and re-engaged, Lee's understanding deepened. He was confronting a commander whose measure of success was not elegance or even immediate victory, but sustained pressure toward a final objective. That recognition did not diminish Lee's resolve. He continued to fight with skill and courage. He adapted where he could. He entrenched more deeply. He sought opportunities to counterstrike. But beneath those efforts lay the awareness that the campaign was no longer a duel of daring maneuvers. It was becoming a test of endurance. Grant's personality, steady, unspectacular, relentless, mirrored the industrial and demographic weight of the Union itself. Lee's brilliance shone in flashes of tactical genius, but flashes could not extinguish a fire that refused to go out a fire that refused to go out. Cow contest. Lee encountered something unfamiliar, an opponent who would not be rattled, who would not concede initiative after suffering, who would not measure success by immediate acclaim. Grant's strength lay not in theatrical gestures, but in an unwavering commitment to remain engaged, to absorb, to press, to continue forward regardless of the emotional shock of loss. By the spring of 1865, the war in Virginia had narrowed to a tightening ring of earthworks and exhausted men. What had begun as a war of maneuver and sweeping campaigns had hardened into trenches stretching for miles around Petersburg and Richmond. The months of pressure applied by Ulysses S. Grant had reduced the contest to endurance alone, and endurance was a resource the Confederacy no longer possessed in equal measure. Within the lines of the Army of Northern Virginia, hunger became a constant companion. Rations dwindled, supplies moved slowly along fragile railroads that were increasingly threatened or severed. Horses starved in their traces, uniforms frayed into rags. Veterans who had marched triumphantly in earlier years now stood in muddy trenches, gaunt and hollow-eyed, clinging to a cause that felt both sacred and slipping away. Robert E. Lee remained composed, his presence steady as ever, But even he could see the arithmetic of war closing in. The Union lines did not disappear after assaults. They did not abandon their positions after repulse. They extended, fortified, and probed again. Grant's grip tightened methodically, cutting rail lines, seizing key positions, stretching Confederate defenses thinner and thinner and thinner. In early April, the breaking point arrived. Union forces launched coordinated offensives along the Petersburg front, targeting weak points in Lee's overstretched lines. The Confederate army, already strained by months of attrition, struggled to hold. When a crucial segment collapsed, the breach rippled outward. Trenches that had held for so long were suddenly untenable. Petersburg could no longer be defended. Richmond, the Confederate capital, lay exposed. The evacuation that followed carried the weight of inevitability. Government officials burned documents. Warehouses were set aflame to prevent supplies from falling into Union hands. Smoke rose over the city as Confederate forces withdrew. Civilians watched in stunned silence as the symbol of their nation's resistance slipped away. Lee did not surrender immediately. He chose retreat over immediate capitulation, hoping to move westward, join remaining Confederate forces, and continue resistance. His army, though battered, still possessed discipline and pride. If it could reach supplies in North Carolina, perhaps the struggle might continue. Grant anticipated this possibility. He did not pursue Reckle, SL. Instead, he maneuvered with precision, dispatching columns to cut off railroads and roadways. Cavalry under Union command raced ahead, seizing intersections, destroying bridges, blocking escape routes. Infantry marched with urgency, closing the gaps. The pursuit was relentless but controlled. Grant sought not vengeance but conclusion. Lee's army moved through the Virginia countryside in growing desperation. Men marched barefoot. Food was scarce. Wagons broke down along muddy roads. Skirmishes erupted as Union cavalry pressed close. Each mile westward felt heavier than the last. At Amelia Courthouse, Lee hoped to find rations waiting for his hungry troops. Instead, he discovered that supplies had not arrived as expected. The delay proved catastrophic. Time was the one resource he could no longer afford to lose. While his men searched for food in surrounding farms, Union forces closed in from multiple directions. The window narrowed. Grant sent messages to Lee suggesting surrender, seeking to spare further bloodshed. Lee declined at first, still searching for a path of escape. But with each passing hour, the avenues shrank. Union troops blocked roads ahead. Artillery positions cut off routes southward. Cavalry patrols reported Confederate movements in detail. On April 8th, Union forces captured key positions near a small Virginia village known as Appomattox Court House. Lee's path forward was effectively sealed. The next morning, Confederate troops attempted a final breakout, striking at what they believed to be a thin Union line. Instead, they encountered strong infantry support. The reality became unmistakable. Lee faced a decision heavier than any he had carried before. To continue fighting would mean needless slaughter. His army was surrounded, outnumbered, exhausted. Ammunition ran low. Rations were gone. The men who had followed him through years of hardship now looked to him not for victory, but for preservation. He chose to meet Grant. The meeting took place in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's home in Appomattox. The contrast between the two commanders was striking. Lee arrived in immaculate dress uniform, sword at his side, boots polished despite the chaos of retreat. Grant entered in a mud-splattered field uniform, his attire reflecting the long campaign rather than ceremonial formality. The atmosphere was quiet, almost subdued. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate officers could retain their sidearms and horses. Soldiers would be paroled and allowed to return home, not imprisoned as traitors. The focus was not humiliation, but reconciliation. Grant understood that the manner of surrender would shape the peace that followed. Lee listened, asked clarifying questions, and agreed. Outside, Union soldiers began to cheer when word spread of the surrender. Grant immediately ordered them to stop. He did not wish the moment to feel like triumph over defeated enemies, but relief that the bloodshed in Virginia was ending. The surrender at Appomattox did not instantly conclude all fighting across the South, but it shattered the Confederacy's primary military force. Other Confederate armies, recognizing the inevitability, soon followed suit. The war that had consumed the nation for 4 years approached its final breath. Grant's persistence had culminated not in a spectacular battlefield annihilation, but in a strategic encirclement that left no alternative. He had applied pressure month after month, denying Lee space to recover, forcing engagement after engagement, constricting resources and options until retreat itself became futile. For Lee, the journey to Appomattox was a progression from confidence to calculation, from daring maneuver to constrained defense, from hope of decisive victory to acknowledgement of strategic exhaustion. He had fought with brilliance and courage, but he had encountered an opponent who would not yield ground psychologically or operationally. At Appomattox Court House, beneath the quiet spring sky, the long arc of the Overland Campaign and the siege of Petersburg converged in a single act of surrender. It was not a dramatic battle, field collapse, but the final expression of a campaign defined by relentless pressure. Grant's refusal to disengage, his willingness to absorb loss in pursuit of ultimate outcome, had carried the Union Army from the tangled forests of the wilderness to the parlor, where Lee signed the papers that ended his command. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join 3 Inevitable Collision, subscribe to join 3 Space of Presence, and share your deepest now in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.